Hey guys, welcome back to Keys of the Cosmos. So the last couple of videos I've done mostly equipment related videos. I've talked about my new mount, and my last video I talked about what to know when you're switching from a DSLR to an astro dedicated camera. But I thought, you know what, let's get back to our astrophotography target tips series and another target to talk about. Now I want to preface this video, I'm not here to make excuses, but we keep it real. The weather here has been terrible, and I know it's been terrible in a lot of parts of the world, but in particular in Canada, not only have we had a lot of clouds and rain this summer so far, but we've had smoke in our skies. It's really sad actually. In Canada we had, I think, over 800 fires at one point, all over, mostly in the west, west of Toronto. Obviously we don't have any too close to me, but yeah, it's really sad. A lot of people have been affected by it in a negative way. Particularly, in a more serious way than astrophotography. So we want to keep things in balance, but we have to, mention that it's affecting our skies. And in fact, here's a picture. This is actually two pictures combined. The top one is a typical evening from my balcony in Toronto, and fairly clear. You can see some clouds in it, but it's very clear. You can even see the horizon there. The bottom one is what it looks like about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So with our smoke in the skies and hot summer days, combine that with haze, you couldn't see anything. I'm talking, you look up and they're on a clear night, and there was 2 or 3 stars visible. It was really bad. It still has not returned to normal. I would say it's still quite bad, but unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is affecting people in a lot worse ways, but as far as astrophotography, it's made it almost impossible. It started to improve, and that's when I went to image the target we're going to be talking about today, and that is the Pacman Nebula. Now, normally, I would, especially that first night, had it been normal weather before and I knew it was going back to normal right after, I probably wouldn't have even bothered. That's how bad it was. Our skies here are bad enough in Toronto. Haze and smoke just makes it even worse. But it had improved enough that I thought, I was so desperate to get out there, I thought. And it was sort of on a whim. Didn't really know what I was going to shoot. I was hoping to continue shooting a target I had started before, but it definitely was not the right conditions for that. So I thought, you know what, let's just try the Pacman Nebula. Now, I've imaged this one before. Here's the picture here. This was fairly early on. I'm going to say maybe 4 or 5 months into the hobby, and I just gotten the Sharpstar 76mm and the L Extreme filter. This was one of the first images I did with it. Now back then I still wasn't logging a ton of exposure time. This is probably 2.5 hours, I'm guessing. Definitely not a great image. You can tell I pushed the exposure on a little too much, trying to pull more gas out than maybe was really there. So it looks a little unnatural, and there's just not a lot of great details. I will say that Pacman is, I would say, an easy to medium target to image. Now it's a magnitude 7.4, I believe, so not crazy bright. It's not dim. It's not like Jellyfish Nebula or something like that, but it's also not Orion or North America or something like that. It's a little bit dim. You're going to have to sink some time into this one, no doubt about it. It's also fairly small, so I would definitely recommend at least 300 millimeters of focal length, but the more the better. I use my Sharpstar which with a reducer is about 339 millimeters. I mean, you can point the red cat at it and you can definitely image it. There's no doubt about that. But if you really want to do it justice, in my opinion anyway, and get a lot of the details within it, because that's what makes these targets so beautiful, you definitely need a little bit more focal length and some integration time. So that's what I'll say about Pacman. But otherwise, it's a beautiful emission nebula that, according to the name, obviously resembles the classic video game character Pac-Man. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So it was rough conditions to start with, but let's talk about how I managed to acquire the data on this and a little bit of processing tips. So first of all, location. Where is the Pacman Nebula located? So it's located in the constellation Cassiopeia. Now Cassiopeia is one of the more recognizable constellations in the mid to late summer, fall skies. It comes up beneath Cepheus. Now Cepheus we talked about in this video for the elephant's trunk, IC 1396. So basically it comes just about right underneath Cepheus, and it sort of has a shape, I don't know, like sort of like a Z, you might say. Here's a picture of the constellation. Those top 3 stars that form what I call an arrow, okay? And there's a reason for that. And it's because those 3 stars, with the middle one being the point of the arrow, point directly at the galaxy Andromeda. We're going to talk about more about that soon in another video. So there's a little bit of a hint of what's to come, and what I had been working on previously and is sort of in limbo at the moment with these terrible conditions. But yeah, Cassiopeia is a very recognizable constellation in the northern eastern skies, let's say. And when it's upright, we're going to be focusing on those top 3 stars. So the middle one that we said, as we mentioned, forms sort of the point of the arrow. Right underneath that and down slightly to the right is where the Pacman Nebula is. So pretty easy to find. Anytime you have a major constellation and one of the most bright stars in that constellation to use as a reference, it's usually pretty easy to find. So if you just go down a little and to the right with a fairly wide field telescope, you're probably going to find it in the first couple tries. So that's the location. Very easy to locate. If you don't even know where Cassiopeia is, I would say the easiest way to find it would be to find Vega, which we've talked about multiple times. That by this point of the year, it's usually pretty high up in the sky by the time it gets dark. And then we follow that down. That will go down to Cygnus, which we've talked about even more on this channel. And then Cygnus, if you take the sort of the horizontal line and go towards the north, so we're going sort of backwards in the swan towards the tail. That points right at Cepheus, as we talked about in this video, and then right underneath Cepheus is Cassiopeia. But you should be able to see it even in the worst of light polluted skies. So let's talk about framing it up. Well, as I mentioned, it's not a very big target, so you shouldn't have any problems, even with, I'd say even with a 100mm telescope, 102mm, it should fit nicely into the frame, and so just try to center it up as best as possible. If you're using something like my Sharpstar 76mm, you're probably going to be doing quite a significant crop. I know I did. The more you crop it, the more bigger it appears, obviously, and you can see more of those details. So you could leave it wide field, but in my opinion, you're not really doing it justice. So you're going to be doing a fairly major crop, so just try to get it as centered as possible. And I think you'll be just fine even on multiple night imaging. Now here's a single exposure. This is a 1-minute exposure. You can see it fairly clearly there. I mean, obviously it's not as clear as some of the brighter targets out there, but it's still obviously recognizable. On a 30-second test shot, I wasn't even sure I had it at first. Let's put it that way. You can see it, but I wasn't even sure because I kind of caught a piece of it on the very first try. It's a humble brag there. But again, I had shot this before. I knew where it was roughly, and I wasn't even sure because it was sort of half on the frame. And I moved the camera over, did another 30-second exposure, and I'm like, yeah, that's it there. But I wasn't even 100% sure. So it is, you definitely want to, as I mentioned, sink some integration time into this. So let's move into integration time and sort of what we use to capture this target. As I mentioned, I use my Sharpstar 76mm. Simply because that's the biggest telescope I can use on my star tracker. I use my ASI 294 MC Pro astro dedicated camera. As I talked about in my last video, because of the smaller sensor size, it gives me a little bit more, at least the appearance of more magnification than my DSLR. I said last time I shot this that I would only revisit it with more focal length to do it justice. Well, unfortunately, I haven't got my mount up and running totally, and I haven't been able to put my bigger refractor on it. So I was forced to use the Sharpstar. I was so desperate to image that I said, what the heck, we'll give it a try. But with the new camera and that smaller sensor, it does appear a little bit bigger. So I think I was definitely able to do more of a crop and show some of those details. So total integration time on this one was 7.75, something like that, hours. So it was shot over 2 nights. Again, I can't stress this enough, less than subpar conditions. So that definitely affected the end result. I'm still happy with the picture given, when all is said and done, but it definitely affected the ability to really capture some of those finer details, I think. So hopefully you have better sky conditions when you try. But yeah, as I mentioned, 2 nights, 7.75 hours. I think for this one, realistically, if you're not able to put that much into it, if you're able to have, if you have good sky conditions and, you know, say something like a DSLR, maybe Astro modified it, I would say you could try to put in at least between 3 to 5 hours. That's, in my opinion, the very least. You can, I mean, you can capture the, with 1.5, 2 hours, you can capture the shape of it and you'll be able to recognize it. But again, you're not going to really do it justice. You're not going to be able to see the details. So if it's your first time shooting and you only have one night, yeah, I say it's worth it. Why not? It's a new target to try, and it'll still be really interesting. See what you can get out of it. But ideally, you want to sink minimum 3 to 5. But I think it's the type of target that if you know you don't have a ton of focal length to point at it, why not? Why not do 7.5, 10, 12 hours? There's enough details in it, in my opinion, to justify sinking that amount of time in. And I may even add some more to this one whenever I'm able to. So 7.75 was what I put into it, and as I mentioned, it was definitely enough to do a sizable crop and still maintain quality on the image. So here's my stacked image. Very dark. Really can't see much at all. In fact, I had to, we'll talk about this in a second, but I had to really stretch this image for it to even appear. I don't know if that had something to do with the sky conditions. I can't say for sure, but yeah, you're really not going to see much at all, I don't think, in the stacked image. I could not see anything. You could not see where it was. I knew it was close to center, but I had to really start stretching and curves adjustments to start to pull it out. So that moves us into processing. So yeah, again, I had to do, I would say 7 or 8 stretches and levels adjustments, which is quite a bit, you know. Coming off some of my last targets that popped out right away, I was a little concerned in fact, at first, because given what I knew about the conditions, I was wondering, oh boy, was this a big waste of time? But it started to pop out, and then I knew I'd be okay. Once I stretched it and all that, I did my star reduction. You know, I always do that. That's just the way I like my images to look. And that sort of helps bring out the gas a little bit as well once you move those stars to the side, and it sort of popped out even more. Now from there, I lassoed off the entire Pacman Nebula and just sort of played with the exposure to pull it out just a little bit more, being very careful not to blow it out. And texture tab, contrast, all those camera raw filter adjustments, you know, just to sort of pull it from the background. At that point, I selected, once it was still selected from the lasso tab, I selected inverse. Okay, so that we've talked about that before. That's where you're protecting your target and you're actually working on everything around it. So that was just to sort of smooth out the background. There were some weird artifacts in the back. You know, you get that from time to time, especially when you do somewhat of a crop like I did on this one. And just sort of get the sky color background, what I wanted, playing with contrast, playing with the blacks tab and shadows tab. Not going too far with it. You don't want your, you know, all your stars to disappear, but at the same time trying to get a fairly consistent and nice background. After I did that, I reselected the target itself and made sure that it still looked natural. Now remember, I've talked about this before, whenever you're doing adjustments to just one part of the picture, there's a little box at the top of Photoshop that says feather, okay? And that's important that you feather. You do not want to leave a hard line when you do that sort of adjustments so that you can see exactly where you made them. You don't want that in your image. You want it to look like it was all shot and processed at once, even though of course we know that's almost never the case. So make sure you feather. I usually do around 40-45 pixels, okay? So that's me personally, but I would say minimum 30. You do not want to leave a hard line, especially when you're doing tricky stuff like that. So once I was happy with sort of the way the entire thing looked, then I went into specific parts of the image, and I'll use my old picture as a reference, as we're going to save the new one for the end of the video. But the 3 key areas I focused on was, first of all, the dark gas that sort of, or dust, whatever it is, that forms sort of the mouth of Pacman. I wanted to bring that a little bit more. That's sort of one of the dead giveaways that it's Pacman, is it has that unique sort of section of dark gas and dust. So I lassoed that off. I played with the texture, contrast, just to sort of make it a little bit darker and, let's say, crisp, so that really stands out. Then I sort of lassoed the bottom part. Okay, there's some plumes, small plumes of gas, kind of look like smokestacks that are really cool, and just some nice details. So again, camera raw filter, played with the texture tab, clarity, all those ones, just to sort of play with it, even a little bit of vibrance. Though I did that more as a whole when I had it lassoed off as a whole. And just to sort of pull out some of those details, again, trying to maintain a natural look though, not going too far with it. And the last thing with it is I sort of lassoed off the center. And for that, the idea was, instead of just looking like a blotch, you know, all one color, I wanted to sort of give it a little bit of variation. I like to do that. Even here on this IC 1396, you see that patch of sort of like pinkish hue. I don't like it to look all one color in the sky. So I lassoed off the center part, and I went to, I've done this before on a couple different targets. I go to the exposure tab in Photoshop, and then there's 3 sliders, and one of them is called gamma correction. Now you got to be really careful with this, because if you go too far, it can really get obvious. But when you slide it to the left, it sort of gives it a lighter tone. If you go too far, it goes white. Okay, so be careful with that, and it starts to become very almost like see-through. So I just went slightly to the left, and it just sort of went from like a reddish orange to more of like a pinky hue, kind of like this. And it just gave it a little bit of variety. Let's put it that way. Again, I don't like to ever just be one big blotch in the sky. I like to look like a little bit of variety, like sort of like the center of it is glowing. That's sort of the look, to give you an idea of what I'm going for. So I played with that, again, feathering at the same time. And then I reselected, then I think I went back and lassoed off the whole thing again and just sort of played with it one more time. Vibrance, a little bit of saturation, just a little. Just to sort of pull it out and make sure it all looked nice as a whole. And each time I do that, I click off of it so I can see the image as it is, okay? And make sure it looks natural. If not, I edit, undo, and then redo it, maybe just toning it back a little bit. But all the while playing with it and just subtle changes, a little bit at a time. Take your time with this one. Like I said, it's worth it. There's a lot of details that you can pull out. You can tell a really good picture of Pacman, okay, with let's say even with a huge telescope where you get a lot of detail, and they took time to process those details, as opposed to one where it's just like a couple hours and you can vaguely see the shape, but it really just looks like a bright red blotch in the sky, and that's really the difference between the two. I mean, anything you can get is good, right? But if you're willing to sink some time, I think you can get an image that really stands out and that you can be really proud of. So that was really it with processing. I would say it's, medium difficulty, easy to medium. It's definitely not super difficult. If you don't have to go crazy stretching it, maybe you're in darker skies and and you didn't have the terrible conditions I had, and it pops out quicker, it'll definitely be easy from there. But play around with it, see what you like, but try to get some variety in it. Try to look for areas that you can attack, or it's not attack, but adjust even on their own, and just make them look unique while still blending in with the rest. That's what I try to do. So that's pretty much it, guys. If you've never tried it before, I say give it a go. Easy to find, pretty easy to process. You don't need a super big telescope for it. Even with a 300 millimeters of focal length, you can, I would say, do it justice. But sink as much time as you can. Do a nice crop so you can get it nice and big on the screen, and hopefully pull out some of those beautiful details. So that's everything I have for the Pacman Nebula. Going forward, as I mentioned, I've started another target. It's been almost a month, I would say, since I've been able to get back at it, maybe 3 weeks. So I'm hoping, again, these sky conditions continue to improve and I can get back on that. So that's going to be a good one. I'm looking forward to that. And a little bit different too, something non-emission nebula. So we can talk about some other filters and some other processing tips. So something more unique. And I'm hoping to have more equipment videos coming soon as I get more familiar with this mount. If we get some good skies, some clear skies, I'll be able to get that mount out more and get sort of the hang of it and start putting my bigger telescopes on, including my refractor telescope that I've never showed on this channel. And also, of course, my Edge HD, which I have shown, but I'm looking forward to using that. Also, quickly mentioning, we are getting close to opposition for Saturn. So that means basically when a planet is at opposition, I'm not going to get into details, but it's at one of our closest points and it's in the prime position for us to image it. So I'm hoping to get my Edge HD going and hopefully have a video on how to do planetary imaging. I've only done it a couple times before. Definitely not an expert, but I got some decent results and I'm hoping to really improve on that with my new scope and the new mount. So look forward to that as well, guys. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. As always, please like and subscribe. I'll have a lot more to come. But without further ado, here is my version, second version now, of the Pacman Nebula. Thanks so much, guys. See you on the next one. bye.